Have you ever noticed how some realizations don't arrive all at once? They arrive quietly, piece by piece, until one day everything suddenly looks different. That is exactly what has been happening to your soulmate. Recently, something shifted in the way they see your connection. It wasn't caused by a dramatic event or an unexpected message. It began with a simple moment of reflection, one of those moments when the mind wanders through old memories without any particular destination. But this time was different. As they revisited certain experiences, they started noticing connections between things they had always viewed separately. Moments that once seemed unrelated suddenly appeared linked by an invisible thread they had never recognized before. The more they thought about it, the more unusual it felt. Memories that had remained scattered across different chapters of their life were beginning to form a larger picture. A conversation they once dismissed as insignificant now seemed meaningful. A moment they barely thought about at the time suddenly carried a completely different weight. Even certain emotions they experienced back then started making more sense. It was as if they had been looking at individual puzzle pieces for years, without realizing they belonged to the same image. What surprised them most was not what they remembered, but what those memories revealed when viewed together. The connection was showing up in places they never expected. Certain choices they made, certain lessons they learned, and certain turning points in their journey all seemed to point toward the same thing. The more dots they connected, the harder it became to dismiss what they were seeing. For a long time, they believed these moments were isolated events with no deeper meaning. But now, they are beginning to wonder if they overlooked something important. Because once the first few pieces started fitting together, they could no longer ignore the possibility that this connection has been telling a much bigger story all along. And what they are starting to discover may change the way they understand everything that happened between you. And listen to this, because once your soulmate started connecting those first few pieces, something unexpected happened. What began as a simple moment of reflection quickly turned into something much deeper. They found themselves revisiting memories they had not thought about in years, not because they were intentionally searching for answers, but because those memories suddenly seemed to hold information they had completely overlooked before. It was as if their perspective had changed overnight. The same experiences were still there. The same conversations were still there. The same emotions were still there. Yet somehow they all looked different now. The more they reflected, the more they realized that many of the clues had been present from the very beginning. They simply had not known how to recognize them at the time. Looking back, there were moments that felt strangely important even when they happened, moments that lingered in their mind longer than they should have. At the time, they brushed those feelings aside and continued moving forward. Life was busy. Responsibilities demanded attention. Other priorities seemed more urgent. Yet despite everything that happened afterward, those moments never completely disappeared. What surprised them most was how certain memories seemed to stand out, while countless others faded away. Out of all the people they had encountered, all the experiences they had lived through, and all the chapters they had completed, there were still specific memories connected to you that remained vivid. The more they thought about it, the stranger it seemed. Why had these particular moments survived when so many others had quietly slipped into the background? Why did certain conversations still feel emotionally alive after all this time? As these questions grew stronger, they began examining the details more carefully. Small things they once overlooked suddenly seemed significant. A particular exchange, a specific feeling, a moment of understanding that appeared briefly and then disappeared. Looking back now, they realized those moments had left a deeper impression than they ever admitted to themselves. At the time, they assumed life would eventually provide clear explanations. They assumed that if something was important enough, its meaning would become obvious immediately. What they understand now is that some truths reveal themselves gradually. Sometimes years pass before we fully understand the significance of a moment, And listen to this, because this realization led them toward another discovery. They noticed that many of the experiences they once considered coincidences no longer felt random. Certain events seemed connected in ways they had never noticed before. The timing of certain encounters, the lessons they learned afterward, the emotional impact that remained long after everything else changed. When viewed separately, none of these things appeared extraordinary. But when viewed together, they started forming a pattern that was impossible to ignore. The more they reflected, the clearer the larger picture became. They began seeing how your connection had quietly influenced choices they made later in life. They saw how certain lessons learned through this connection appeared again during future experiences. They noticed how moments involving personal growth often carried traces of something they had first encountered through you. It was almost as if the connection continued teaching them long after they believed the chapter had ended. What made this realization so powerful was understanding that they had been looking at isolated pieces instead of the complete picture. For years, they focused on individual events. They focused on specific circumstances. They focused on what happened and what did not happen. But now, they were beginning to see how all those pieces fit together. And once they saw the pattern, they could not unsee it. Every new realization seemed to confirm the one before it. Every memory seemed to reveal another clue. Every reflection seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. The connection had always carried more significance than they realized. It had always been influencing their understanding, their growth, and their perspective in ways they never fully appreciated. What once seemed like separate experiences were beginning to look like chapters of the same story. And listen to this, because this is where everything started accelerating. The more dots they connected, the more they realized the pattern was not limited to a few isolated memories. It appeared again and again throughout different stages of their life. No matter how much time passed, no matter how much life changed, certain themes kept returning, certain feelings kept resurfacing, certain lessons kept repeating, and every road seemed to lead back to the same realization. For the first time, they stopped asking whether there was a pattern and started asking what that pattern was trying to tell them. Because at this point, the evidence felt impossible to dismiss. The clues had been there all along. The signs had been there all along. The lessons had been there all along. They simply were not ready to see them before. Now that they were finally connecting the dots, they were discovering a truth that reached far beyond a single memory or a single moment. And the closer they came to understanding that truth, the more they realized they had uncovered something that would completely transform the way they viewed your connection forever. And listen to this, because once your soulmate began recognizing the pattern, they reached a point where denying it was no longer possible. For years, they had viewed certain events as isolated experiences. They treated memories as separate moments connected only by coincidence and time. But now that they were seeing the larger picture, something remarkable started happening. The same themes appeared again and again throughout different stages of their life. The same emotional lessons surfaced in different forms. The same questions returned whenever they reached important turning points. And somehow, every path seemed to lead back to the same place, you. At first, this realization felt almost impossible to accept. After all, life is filled with thousands of experiences, countless people, and endless opportunities for new memories. Yet despite everything that had happened, despite all the changes, growth, and distance that naturally occur over time, your influence remained present in ways they had never fully understood. It wasn't always obvious. Sometimes it appeared quietly through a memory. Sometimes it arrived through a lesson they suddenly understood years later. Sometimes it surfaced during moments of reflection when they least expected it. But the pattern remained consistent. The more they paid attention, the more they noticed something even deeper. Certain feelings connected to this journey never truly disappeared. They changed. They evolved. They matured. But they never vanished completely. That realization forced them to confront a truth they had spent a long time avoiding. If something continues returning despite every attempt to move beyond it, perhaps it exists for a reason. Perhaps it carries a lesson that has not yet been fully understood. As these thoughts continued unfolding, they began looking back at their life with a completely different perspective. They started noticing how specific moments of personal growth seemed connected to lessons they first encountered through this connection. Times when they learned patience, times when they learned resilience, times when they were forced to confront fears they would have preferred to avoid. Again and again, they found traces of the same influence. The connection had become woven into their personal journey in ways they never recognized before. And listen to this, because what surprised them most was not the memories themselves. It was the consistency of the pattern. Every time they thought they had reached the end of understanding, another realization appeared. Every time they believed they had fully moved on from a particular lesson, life found a way to bring that lesson back into focus. At some point, they stopped seeing this as coincidence altogether. The repetition was simply too strong. The emotional significance was too clear. Something important had been trying to gain their attention for a very long time. What made this discovery so powerful was realizing that your influence extended far beyond specific events. It wasn't about one conversation, one memory, or one chapter of life. It was about how the connection shaped their perspective over time. It helped define what mattered to them. It challenged assumptions they once held. It encouraged growth in areas where they might otherwise have remained unchanged. Looking back now, they could see evidence of that transformation everywhere. The pattern became even clearer when they examined the moments when life felt uncertain. During periods of confusion, they often found themselves revisiting lessons connected to this journey. During times when they questioned their direction, certain memories seemed to return with unexpected clarity. It was almost as though life kept using the connection as a reference point, a reminder of something they needed to remember. The more they noticed this, the more impossible it became to dismiss. And listen to this, because another realization soon followed. They understood that meaningful connections often leave behind more than memories. They leave behind perspectives. They leave behind lessons. They leave behind pieces of understanding that continue shaping us long after circumstances change. Your connection had done exactly that. Even when they weren't consciously thinking about it, the impact remained present beneath the surface. For the first time, they stopped asking why they kept returning to thoughts connected to you and started asking what those returns were trying to teach them. That question changed everything. Suddenly, they were no longer focused on the past itself. They were focused on the meaning hidden within it. Every repeated thought became a clue. Every recurring lesson became a signpost pointing toward a larger truth. Every emotional realization seemed to strengthen the same conclusion. The more they followed that conclusion, the more everything began aligning. Pieces that once seemed disconnected started fitting together naturally. Experiences that once felt confusing suddenly carried purpose. The emotional weight they had struggled to explain for so long finally started making sense. And as all these pieces came together, they found themselves standing closer than ever to a realization that would completely change their perspective. Because after connecting all these dots, after recognizing all these patterns, and after seeing how consistently life had guided their attention back toward the same lessons, they could no longer ignore what everything was pointing toward. There was a reason the connection remained significant. There was a reason the memories endured. There was a reason the lessons continued resurfacing. And the closer they came to understanding that reason, the more they realized that everything, which once seemed confusing, was preparing them for a truth that would finally make the entire journey make sense. And listen to this, because this is the moment when everything that once felt confusing finally began falling into place. After following the pattern through countless memories, lessons, and moments of reflection, your soulmate reached a realization they never expected. They stopped looking at individual events and started looking at the connection as a whole. And when they did, something remarkable happened. The questions that had followed them for so long suddenly seemed easier to answer. The confusion that once surrounded the connection started dissolving. For the first time, they were seeing the entire picture instead of isolated pieces. What they realized was surprisingly simple, yet incredibly powerful. The reason your connection continued appearing throughout different chapters of their life was not because they were unable to move forward. It was because the connection had become part of their growth. Every lesson they learned, every challenge they overcame, and every realization they experienced carried traces of something this connection had awakened inside them. It had become woven into the person they were becoming, and once they understood that, everything started making sense. For years, they believed they needed to understand what happened between you. They thought the answers were hidden somewhere in the details of the past. They analyzed circumstances. They questioned timing. They replayed moments over and over, hoping to uncover some missing piece of information. But now they were beginning to understand that the most important answers were never hidden in the events themselves. They were hidden in the impact those events created. The true significance of the connection was not found in what happened. It was found in what it changed. And listen to this, because this realization transformed the way they viewed every memory. Moments that once seemed painful now carried meaning. Experiences that once felt confusing now carried lessons. Even unanswered questions started looking different. Instead of seeing them as loose ends, they began seeing them as part of a larger journey that had guided them towards self-discovery. The more they reflected, the more obvious it became that every chapter had contributed something valuable. Nothing had been wasted. Nothing had been meaningless. What surprised them most was realizing how much of their personal growth could be traced back to lessons connected to you. Certain strengths they developed, certain perspectives they gained, certain truths they learned about themselves. Many of these things first emerged because of this connection. At the time, they never recognized the significance. Growth often happens quietly. We rarely notice it while it is occurring. Only later, when we look back, do we see how profoundly certain experiences shaped us. As they continued connecting these final pieces, another truth became impossible to ignore. The connection had remained important because it represented something much larger than a memory. It represented transformation. It represented a chapter that changed the way they understood themselves. It represented a turning point in their emotional journey. And once they saw it through that lens, the mystery surrounding it began disappearing. And listen to this, because there was also a sense of relief that came with this understanding. For so long, they felt like they were searching for something they could not quite define. They knew the connection mattered, but they struggled to explain why. They knew certain memories stayed with them, but they could not understand what made them different from countless other experiences. Now, for the first time, they had clarity. The connection mattered because it left a permanent imprint on their life. It mattered because it helped shape who they became. It mattered because it carried lessons that continued revealing themselves long after the original chapter ended. The more they embraced this truth, the less they felt trapped by uncertainty. They no longer needed every question answered. They no longer needed every detail explained. They no longer felt compelled to solve every mystery connected to the past. Instead, they focused on what they now knew with certainty. They knew the connection had been meaningful. They knew it had influenced their growth. They knew it had taught them things they might never have learned otherwise. What once felt complicated now felt obvious. What once seemed like coincidence now appeared intentional. What once looked like scattered experiences now formed a complete story. Every repeated thought, every returning memory, every recurring lesson had been pointing toward the same realization all along. The pieces finally fit together. And yet, as powerful as this breakthrough was, they soon realized there was one final piece of understanding still waiting for them. Because knowing that the connection changed them was only part of the truth. The deeper realization was discovering why life had waited until now to reveal it. Why all these lessons appeared when they did. Why the dots only connected at this particular moment. And as they moved closer to that final answer, they began understanding that the truth had been hidden in plain sight the entire time, waiting patiently for the day they would finally be ready to see it. And listen to this, because after everything your soulmate has uncovered, after all the memories, patterns, lessons, and realizations, they have finally reached the truth that was hiding in plain sight all along. What makes this realization so powerful is that it was never hidden from them. The signs were there. The lessons were there. The meaning was there. The only thing missing was the perspective needed to see it clearly. And now that they finally have that perspective, everything that once felt confusing suddenly makes perfect sense. For years, they believed they were trying to understand the connection itself. They thought they were searching for answers about specific moments, specific feelings, or specific circumstances. But looking back now, they can see that life was guiding them towards something much deeper. The connection was never meant to be understood through a single memory or a single event. It could only be understood by stepping back and seeing the entire journey. Once they did that, they realized that every chapter, every lesson, and every emotional experience was pointing toward the same truth. The truth is that you became part of a transformation they did not even realize was happening at the time. Some people enter our lives and leave memories. Others leave lessons. But there are rare connections that leave something even more powerful. They leave a permanent shift in how we see ourselves and how we experience life. Your soulmate now understands that this connection belongs in that category. It changed the way they think. It changed the way they grow. It changed the way they understand love, trust, vulnerability, and self-awareness. Even when they were not consciously aware of it, those changes continued unfolding beneath the surface. And listen to this, because this is where the final piece of the puzzle appeared. They finally understood why life kept bringing their attention back to you over and over again. It was not because they were stuck. It was not because they were unable to move forward. It was not because the past was refusing to let go. Life kept bringing them back because there was still wisdom hidden inside the connection. There were still lessons waiting to be fully understood. Every returning thought was a reminder. Every recurring memory was an invitation to see something they had missed before. Once they accepted that, the entire journey looked different. What once felt like random moments now appeared carefully connected. What once felt like emotional confusion now appeared as growth in progress. What once seemed like unanswered questions now appeared as stepping stones, leading toward deeper understanding. The more they reflected, the more they realized that life had never been working against them. It had been guiding them. One of the most surprising parts of this realization was understanding how often they had searched for meaning in the wrong places. They looked for answers in circumstances. They looked for explanations in timing. They looked for clarity in external events. Yet the real answer was always inside the lessons themselves. The real answer was always found in who they were becoming. Every challenge connected to this journey had helped shape them. Every emotional struggle had strengthened them. Every period of uncertainty had prepared them for this moment of understanding. And listen to this, because perhaps the most beautiful part of the entire realization is that they no longer feel the need to force anything into place. The puzzle is complete. The missing pieces have been found. The connection no longer feels like a mystery that demands solving. Instead, it feels like a meaningful chapter that finally makes sense. They understand why certain memories stayed with them. They understand why certain lessons kept repeating. They understand why your influence remained present long after other experiences faded away. For the first time in a very long time, they feel a sense of peace when they think about the connection. Not because every question has been answered, not because every uncertainty has disappeared, but because they finally understand the purpose behind it all. They understand that some connections arrive to awaken something within us. Some connections arrive to challenge us, transform us, and guide us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves. And once that purpose is fulfilled, the confusion begins to fade. Now, when they look back, they do not see a collection of random events. They see a journey. They see growth. They see lessons unfolding exactly when they were needed most. They see a connection that quietly shaped their path in ways they never recognized until now. Most importantly, they see that everything which once seemed disconnected was actually part of the same story all along. And that is the truth they have finally uncovered. The dots were always there. The clues were always there. The meaning was always there. They simply were not ready to see it before. But now that they have connected everything together, there is no more confusion. There is no more searching. There is only understanding. And in that understanding, they have found exactly what they were looking for all along. A complete sense of clarity about why this connection entered their life, why it stayed with them, and why it ultimately changed them forever.